The cozy hum of conversation filled the small, family-owned restaurant, blending with the clinking of silverware and the warm aroma of home-cooked meals. The place wasn't fancy, but it had character, the kind of spot where regulars knew each other by name, and where strangers could feel at home. It was the perfect escape from the rush of the outside world, where everyone could take a moment to slow down and share a meal. At a corner table near the window, an elderly man sat alone, carefully spooning his soup. His hands trembled slightly, and the thin coat draped over his shoulders suggested he had seen better days. Despite his fragile appearance, there was a quiet dignity about him, a man who had lived through countless stories, but carried them silently. Not far away, a tall, kind-looking man sat with his young son, quietly enjoying their lunch. The man's deep, warm laughter occasionally filled the air, drawing glances from nearby tables. His presence was magnetic, and it was clear he had a way of making people around him feel at ease. Though he wasn't flashy or loud, there was something undeniably inspiring about his confidence and calm demeanor. The peace of the afternoon took a sudden turn when the sound of raised voices pierced the restaurant's tranquil atmosphere. A group of men, loud and rowdy, had entered the space, their energy shifting the mood. They scanned the room with an air of entitlement, their eyes landing on the elderly man in the corner. One of them smirked before nudging another, and soon, they were making their way toward him. At first, it was subtle, snide comments muttered just loud enough for the man to hear. Then came the mocking laughter, followed by cruel remarks about his appearance. The elderly man tried to ignore them, keeping his head down, but it was impossible to miss the discomfort etched on his face. He seemed to shrink under their taunts, his trembling hands struggling to steady the spoon he held. The kind man watched from his table, his expression shifting from confusion to quiet anger. His son, noticing the change in his father's demeanor, looked up with wide, questioning eyes. "Dad, why are they being mean to him?" he asked softly, his innocent voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The man's heart ached at his son's question. He wanted to shield him from the ugliness of the world, but he also knew this was a moment to show his boy what it meant to stand up for what was right. Taking a deep breath, he pushed back his chair and stood up, his presence immediately commanding attention. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as he walked toward the elderly man's table. "Hey," he said firmly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. "That's enough." The group of men turned to him, their amusement fading as they sized him up. The leader of the group, a stocky man with a cocky grin, took a step closer. "What's it to you?" he sneered. "Mind your own business." The kind man didn't flinch. He glanced at the elderly man, who looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear, before returning his gaze to the group. "It is my business when I see someone being treated like this," he said evenly. "You've had your fun. Leave him alone." For a moment, the group seemed to consider their options. The restaurant had fallen completely silent, all eyes fixed on the confrontation. The leader's grin faltered, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "Look at you, trying to play hero," he scoffed. "You don't want to mess with us." The kind man's expression didn't waver. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "But if that's what you want, I'm ready." The tension in the room was palpable. The leader hesitated, clearly unsure of how far he was willing to push this. Finally, with a dismissive wave, he turned to his friends. "Let's go," he muttered, trying to save face. "This place isn't worth it." One by one, the men followed him out, their bravado deflating as they left the restaurant. The door closed behind them, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. Quiet murmurs of relief rippled through the patrons, but the kind man wasn't looking for praise. He turned back to the elderly man, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. "You okay?" he asked gently. The elderly man nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he said, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stepped in." The man offered a reassuring smile. You don't have to worry about them anymore, he said. You're safe now. As he returned to his table, his son beamed at him with pride. Dad, you're a hero! The boy exclaimed, his admiration clear in his eyes. The man chuckled softly, ruffling his son's hair. I'm no hero, buddy, he said. I just did what anyone should do. But not everyone agreed. The next day, as he went about his routine, the man noticed a police car parked outside his house. His heart sank as a uniformed officer stepped out and approached him. The man straightened, keeping his expression calm, but a knot of unease tightened in his chest. Good morning, sir, the officer began, his tone polite but professional. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened at the restaurant yesterday. The man frowned, surprised. Questions? About what? There's been a complaint filed, the officer explained. The individuals you confronted claimed you threatened them. The man's jaw tightened, a mix of disbelief and frustration bubbling inside him. He thought about his son, who had watched him stand up for someone in need, and now this? He kept his composure, knowing he needed to handle the situation carefully. I didn't threaten anyone, he said firmly. I just asked them to stop harassing an elderly man. That's all. The officer studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. I understand, he said finally. But I still need to take your statement. As the man began recounting the events of the previous day, he couldn't help but wonder if doing the right thing had made him a target. What kind of world was this, where standing up for someone could lead to this kind of trouble? The officer's questions grew more pointed, and though his tone remained neutral, the man couldn't shake the feeling that he was being treated as if he'd done something wrong. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he refused to back down. He had stood up for what was right, and he would do it again, no matter the cost. Little did he know, this confrontation was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, the group of men he had faced off against wasn't ready to let things go. They were determined to twist the narrative, to paint him as the aggressor and themselves as the victims. As the officer finished taking his statement and left, the man stood on his porch, watching the police car disappear down the street. His son's voice broke the silence. Dad, are you in trouble? He asked, his small face filled with worry. The man knelt down, placing a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. Don't worry, buddy, he said softly. We'll get through this. Sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, people might try to make it hard for you. But that doesn't mean you stop doing the right thing. The boy nodded, though his worry didn't entirely fade. The man straightened, glancing down the street as a sense of resolve settled over him. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let fear or intimidation stop him from standing up for what was right. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood, the man couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The night passed slowly for the kind man. Sleep didn't come easily, his mind replaying the events at the restaurant and the officer's visit. He stared at the ceiling in the dim glow of the streetlights outside, his thoughts circling around what might happen next. The officer hadn't been hostile, but there was something unsettling about the questions, like they were looking for something to pin on him. He'd stood up for an innocent man, yet here he was, feeling like the one under scrutiny. His son had fallen asleep beside him, clutching a small stuffed animal. The boy's face was peaceful, free from the worries of the adult world. It was moments like this that reminded the man why he always tried to do the right thing. He wanted to show his son what it meant to be a good person, even when it was hard. But now, he couldn't shake the worry that his actions might put them both in harm's way. The next morning, the man got up early. He brewed a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen. As he poured himself a cup, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hesitating for a moment, he finally picked up. Hello? He said cautiously. Is this the man from the restaurant yesterday? A gruff voice asked. The man's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? Doesn't matter, the voice replied. Just wanted to give you a piece of advice. Next time, mind your own business. The line went dead before he could respond. He stared at the phone, his heart pounding. It wasn't hard to guess who the caller might be. The group of men from the restaurant must have gotten his number somehow. The thought sent a chill through him, but he quickly pushed the fear aside. Whoever it was, they weren't going to intimidate him. He'd faced worse things in his life and come out stronger. Later that day, he decided to visit the restaurant again. He wanted to check on the elderly man, to make sure he was okay. As he stepped through the familiar door, the owner, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. You're back, she said, her voice carrying a note of concern. I was worried about you after what happened. I'm fine, the man replied, though he couldn't entirely hide the tension in his voice. I just wanted to see if the man from yesterday has been here. I wanted to check on him. The owner shook her head. He hasn't been back. Poor guy looked so shaken up when he left. I hope he's all right. The man nodded, his worry deepening. The elderly man had seemed so fragile, and now he was out there somewhere, possibly still afraid. The thought weighed heavily on him. He thanked the owner and turned to leave, but before he could step outside, another customer approached him. Hey, the man said quietly. I saw what you did yesterday. That was brave. The kind man offered a small, tired smile. I just did what anyone should do. The customer shook his head. Not everyone would have stepped in like that. People are scared these days. But you did the right thing. The words were meant as encouragement, but they didn't ease the knot in his chest. As he left the restaurant and walked back to his car, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting someone to be watching him. The streets seemed quieter than usual, the air heavy with an unease he couldn't quite place. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. A car he didn't recognize parked down the street from his house and stayed there for hours. At first, he thought it was nothing, just someone visiting a neighbor. But then it happened again the next day. And the day after that. He noticed the same car in his rearview mirror when he drove to the grocery store, though it never got too close. One evening, as he and his son sat down to dinner, there was a knock at the door. His heart jumped, but he kept his face calm for his son's sake. Stay here, he told the boy gently before walking to the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw another police officer standing on the porch. Opening the door, he forced a polite smile. Officer. What can I do for you? The officer, younger than the one who had come before, shifted awkwardly. Sorry to bother you, sir. We just need to follow up on the incident at the restaurant. The man frowned, crossing his arms. I already gave my statement. I understand, the officer said quickly. But there have been additional complaints. Complaints? The man repeated, his voice tight. From who? I can't disclose that, the officer replied, looking uncomfortable. But I need to ask if you've had any further contact with the individuals involved. No, the man said firmly. I haven't. But they've been harassing me. Strange phone calls. Cars parked outside my house. Maybe you should be looking into them. The officer shifted again, clearly uneasy. I'll make a note of that, he said, though his tone didn't inspire much confidence. Thank you for your time. As the officer walked away, the man closed the door and leaned against it, frustration bubbling inside him. It felt like he was being targeted, while the real troublemakers were walking free. His son's voice broke through his thoughts. Dad, was that the police again? The boy asked, his small face worried. Yeah, the man said, trying to sound casual. They just had a few questions. Nothing to worry about. But the boy wasn't convinced. Are they mad at you because of what happened at the restaurant? The man crouched down, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes, Doing the right thing isn't easy, he said softly. But it's still the right thing. You remember that, okay? The boy nodded, though his expression remained troubled. The man hugged him tightly, vowing to protect him no matter what. That night, as he sat on the couch with the TV playing softly in the background, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from an unknown number. You think you're a hero? You'll regret this. The man stared at the message, his jaw clenching. Whoever was behind this was getting bolder. He thought about calling the police, but after their lackluster response earlier, he wasn't sure it would help. Instead, he saved the number and decided to keep a record of every call and message he received. If it came to it, he wanted evidence. The days continued to pass, each one bringing a new layer of tension. The mysterious car stopped showing up, but the calls and messages persisted. The man started to notice unfamiliar faces in places he frequented: the grocery store, the park where he took his son to play. At first, he thought he was being paranoid, but the feeling was too strong to ignore. One afternoon, as he walked his son home from school, a man stepped out from behind a parked car and blocked their path. He wasn't one of the men from the restaurant, but there was something threatening about him. His stance was too deliberate, his gaze too cold. You've been making a lot of noise, the man said, his voice low and menacing. You'd better think twice before crossing the wrong people. The kind man placed a protective arm around his son, his heart racing. I don't know what you're talking about, he said evenly, refusing to show fear. The man smirked. Oh, I think you do. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. The man stood frozen for a moment, his son clutching his hand tightly. Dad, who was that? The boy asked, his voice trembling. Just someone trying to scare us, the man replied, though his voice was tight. But don't worry. I won't let anything happen to you. He walked the rest of the way home with his head held high, but inside, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. His son was being dragged into this, and that was something he couldn't tolerate. As he locked the door behind them, he knew he needed to make a decision. He couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. It was time to take action, but he wasn't sure where to start. All he knew was that he couldn't back down, not now, not ever. The atmosphere around the house felt heavier with each passing day. The man tried to keep life as normal as possible for his son, but the tension was becoming harder to hide. He stayed vigilant, double-checking the locks on the doors at night and looking over his shoulder wherever he went. The once quiet neighborhood now felt like a maze of unseen eyes and whispers. One evening, as he sat by the window with the curtains slightly drawn, he spotted the car again, the same one that had been parked down the street days ago. This time, it wasn't keeping its distance. The car was parked directly across from his house, the headlights off, but the silhouette of someone sitting inside clearly visible. His stomach twisted in knots, but he refused to panic. He turned off the lights in the living room to avoid drawing attention and watched carefully from the shadows. The car stayed there for hours, unmoving, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the first mistake. The man's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. The text read, "We're watching. Think carefully about your next move." His fists tightened around the phone. Whoever was behind this wanted him to feel helpless, to back down. But he wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. He thought about calling the police, but then he remembered the officer's hesitant attitude and lack of real help. Still, he couldn't let this continue. Taking a deep breath, he decided to step outside, determined to confront whoever was in the car. He told his son to stay in his room and locked the front door behind him. The cool night air hit his face as he walked down the steps. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. Each step toward the car felt like a lifetime, the silence around him amplifying every sound: the crunch of his shoes on the gravel, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. When he reached the sidewalk, the driver's side window of the car rolled down slowly. A man leaned out, his face partially hidden by the shadows. The man from the restaurant. His smirk was unmistakable, even in the dim light. "You've got guts," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But guts only get you so far. What do you want from me?" The kind man asked, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside him. "I didn't do anything wrong. That's the problem," the man replied, leaning forward slightly. "You couldn't just let things be. You had to play the hero, stick your nose where it didn't belong." The kind man took a step closer, his jaw tight. "I didn't stick my nose anywhere. I stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. If that bothers you, then maybe you're the one with the problem." The man in the car laughed coldly, the sound echoing through the quiet street. "You've got a lot to learn about how the world works, my friend. And lesson number 1? People like you don't win." The car's engine roared to life, and the man inside gave him one last look before driving off into the night. The kind man stood there for a long moment, watching the taillights fade into the distance. He felt a mix of anger and unease. The threat was clear, but it also felt like the beginning of something bigger, something he wasn't fully prepared for. The next day, things escalated further. As he walked his son to school, he noticed a flyer taped to a telephone pole near the entrance. It had his picture on it, along with bold letters that read, "Dangerous troublemaker. Stay away." His stomach sank as he pulled it down, his hands trembling slightly. He quickly looked around, but no one seemed to be watching. His son tugged at his hand. "Dad, what's that?" the boy asked, peering at the paper. "Nothing, buddy," the man said, folding it quickly and shoving it into his pocket. "Just someone's idea of a bad joke." But as they continued walking, he noticed more of the flyers scattered around the neighborhood on lampposts, bus stops, and even the bulletin board outside a grocery store. Someone was trying to paint him as a threat, to turn people against him. The thought was infuriating, but it also made him more determined than ever to fight back. Later that afternoon, he decided to take the flyers to the police station. He figured that if he couldn't rely on their help, he could at least create a paper trail. The officer at the front desk listened to his story but didn't seem particularly concerned. "We'll look into it," the officer said with a vague nod, handing the flyers back to him. "Probably just some kids pulling a prank." "This isn't a prank," the man said firmly. "These people have been following me, threatening me. I need someone to take this seriously." The officer sighed, glancing at the clock on the wall. "I'll file a report. But unless something more concrete happens, there's not much we can do." The man left the station feeling more frustrated than ever. He'd done everything he could think of reporting the harassment, standing his ground, trying to live his life as normally as possible. But it seemed like the harder he tried, the more the situation spiraled out of control. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, he heard a noise outside, a faint shuffling, followed by the sound of glass breaking. His heart leapt as he rushed to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. Someone was standing in his front yard, a dark figure barely illuminated by the streetlight. They were holding something in their hand, and it didn't take long to realize it was a brick. Before he could react, the figure hurled the brick through the front window, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the house. His son screamed from his room, and the man ran to grab him, shielding him from the chaos. He could hear footsteps outside, the sound of people running away into the night. Holding his son close, the man dialed 911 with shaking hands. This time, there was no question about what had happened. The attack was deliberate, meant to send a message. When the police arrived, they surveyed the damage and took his statement, but their response was the same as before, sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. "You're doing the right thing by reporting this," one of the officers said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But without any solid leads, there's not much we can do." The man clenched his fists, his frustration threatening to boil over. "So I just wait until something worse happens? Is that it?" The officer looked uncomfortable but didn't answer. As the patrol car pulled away, the man stood on his porch, staring at the broken glass scattered across the floor. He felt a mix of anger, fear, and exhaustion. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted or until he made them stop. That night, as he cleaned up the mess and tried to calm his son, he realized that the situation had reached a breaking point. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over his shoulder and waiting for the next attack. He needed to find out who was behind this, and why they were so determined to ruin his life. He spent hours at his computer, digging through every detail he could remember from the restaurant incident. The faces of the men, the tone of their threats, even the specific words they used, it all seemed to point to something bigger than just a grudge. As he pieced the puzzle together, a pattern began to emerge, one that hinted at a larger web of corruption and power. But just as the pieces started to fall into place, his computer screen flickered. A new email popped into his inbox from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line sent a chill down his spine. "You don't know who you're dealing with." He opened the email cautiously, his heart pounding as he read the message. It was short but chilling. "This is your last warning. Stop digging, or you'll regret it." The man stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. He was no longer just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his son, for his right to live in peace, for the principle of standing up against those who thought they could intimidate him into silence. He didn't know exactly what he was up against, but one thing was clear: he wasn't backing down. The man stared at the email for what felt like hours, the words repeating in his mind like a haunting echo. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Every instinct told him to stop, to shut down his computer, to ignore everything and just try to go back to his normal life. But how could he? The threats weren't just targeting him anymore. His son, his home, everything he cared about was at risk. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. His son was asleep upstairs, unaware of the mounting danger that seemed to creep closer with every passing moment. The man couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He got up and checked all the windows and doors again, making sure everything was locked. Then, he grabbed his phone and began typing a message to the officer who had taken his statement earlier that night. But halfway through, he stopped. What was the point? They'd already made it clear they couldn't or wouldn't help. Just as he was about to put his phone down, it vibrated in his hand. Another text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. This one was different from the others. It read, "We're closer than you think." His blood ran cold. He spun around, his eyes darting to the windows, the shadows outside shifting in the dim light of the street lamp. Were they out there now? Watching him? Before he could process the message, his phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a text. It was a video link. Against his better judgment, he clicked it, his hands trembling. The video started with grainy footage of him and his son walking down the street earlier that day. The angle suggested it had been taken from a car or a nearby window. The camera followed them as they turned the corner, completely unaware they were being watched. Then the video cut to a shot of his house. The footage was shaky, as if taken by someone hiding in the bushes. The message was clear: they weren't just watching, they were close. Too close. His first instinct was to run upstairs, grab his son, and leave. But where would they go? And what guarantee did he have that they wouldn't be followed? He paced the living room, his mind racing. Whoever these people were, they had resources. They weren't just some random bullies trying to scare him. There was something bigger at play, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the restaurant incident had only been the spark. This wasn't just about standing up for the elderly man anymore. This was about silencing him, making sure he didn't uncover whatever they were hiding. Unable to sit still, he decided to review the footage again, hoping to find some clue. As he scrubbed through the video, He noticed something he hadn't seen before: a car parked down the street, the same one that had been following him for days. But this time, the video showed more. In one brief frame, as the camera panned, the car's driver's side door was open, and a figure was stepping out. He paused the video and zoomed in as much as he could. The image was blurry, but the person's silhouette was unmistakable. It was the man from the restaurant. The man's heart raced as he pieced it together. The person who had threatened him that night wasn't just some angry diner. He was part of something larger, and now it was clear that the harassment wasn't random. There was a reason they were targeting him, and it had to be tied to what he had witnessed. But what was it? He replayed the events in his mind, trying to remember every detail of that night. Then it hit him. The elderly man he had defended had been arguing about something specific, something about evidence and accountability. At the time, it had seemed like a heated argument over poor treatment, but now he wondered if it had been more than that. Could the elderly man have been a whistleblower? Someone who knew too much? And by stepping in, had he accidentally drawn attention to himself as a potential ally? As these thoughts raced through his mind, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail. He hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The voice on the other end was raspy and hurried, almost panicked. "You don't know me, but you're in danger," the voice said. "They won't stop until they get what they're after. You need to find him, the old man from the restaurant. He's the key to all of this." The message ended abruptly, leaving more questions than answers. How was he supposed to find the elderly man? He didn't even know his name. But one thing was clear: this wasn't over. If anything, it was only getting started. He didn't know who had left the voicemail. But they were right about one thing: he was in danger, and he needed to act fast. The next day, he began his search. He started by calling the restaurant, hoping someone there might have information about the elderly man. The manager was reluctant to share details at first, citing privacy concerns, but after some convincing, he admitted that the man was a regular customer. He didn't know much, but he remembered the man mentioning a community center where he volunteered. Armed with this small lead, the man decided to check out the community center. It was a modest building on the edge of town, bustling with activity. He scanned the room, looking for the elderly man, but he didn't see him. He approached one of the volunteers, describing the man he was looking for. The volunteer's expression shifted immediately, a mix of recognition and concern. "You're looking for Mr. H?" she asked, lowering her voice. "He hasn't been here in a few days." "That's unusual for him." The man's stomach dropped. "Do you know where I can find him?" "It's urgent." The volunteer hesitated before nodding. "He lives in an apartment a few blocks from here. But if you're looking for him, be careful. He's been saying some strange things lately, like he thinks someone's after him." The man thanked her and left, his heart pounding. If the elderly man was in hiding, it confirmed his suspicions. He hurried to the address the volunteer had given him, a small apartment complex tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. When he arrived, he found the door slightly ajar, the lock broken. His chest tightened as he pushed the door open. The apartment was in disarray, as if someone had searched it in a hurry. Papers were scattered across the floor, furniture overturned. But there was no sign of the elderly man. He stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for clues. On the coffee table, he noticed a folder, its contents spilling out. He picked it up and flipped through the pages, his heart racing as he realized what he was holding. The documents detailed financial records, emails, and photographs, all pointing to corruption at a high level. The names listed in the files were powerful, people with the resources to make someone disappear. This was what the elderly man had been trying to expose. And now, by stumbling into it, the kind man realized he had become a target too. Just as he was about to leave, he heard footsteps outside the door. He froze, his pulse racing. Someone was coming. Whoever it was, they weren't here to help. He looked around frantically for a place to hide, his mind racing with thoughts of how to protect himself and the truth he now held in his hands. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, and unhurried, as if whoever was approaching knew there was no rush. The man held his breath and instinctively backed into the corner of the apartment. Clutching the folder to his chest, he scanned the room for anything he could use to protect himself. His hand brushed against a heavy lamp on the side table. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The door creaked open, and a shadow fell across the room. A figure stepped inside, tall and imposing, wearing dark clothes. The man's heart pounded as he gripped the lamp tighter, every muscle in his body tense. But then, the figure spoke. "Don't do anything stupid. I'm here to help." The voice was familiar. It was the officer from the restaurant, the one who had spoken to him after the initial confrontation. But something about his calm demeanor and the way he moved made the man suspicious. "Help?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't seem too interested in helping me before." The officer closed the door behind him and gestured for the man to lower the lamp. "I couldn't say much back then. Too many years. But I know what's going on, and I know who's behind it. If you want to stay alive, you'll need to trust me." The man hesitated, his grip on the lamp loosening slightly. "If you know what's going on, then where is the old man? Where's Mr. H?" The officer's face darkened. "That's why I'm here. They got to him. He's gone." The words hit the man like a punch to the gut. He had suspected as much when he saw the state of the apartment, but hearing it out loud made it real. "Gone?" he echoed, his voice shaking. "What do you mean, gone?" The officer sighed, his expression grim. He was trying to expose something big. Too big. They silenced him before he could go public. "But he left this," he said, gesturing toward the folder in the man's hands. "And if they find out you have it, you'll be next." The man looked down at the folder, his mind racing. "Why are you telling me this? What's in it for you?" The officer hesitated, then said, "Because I've been working undercover for months, trying to bring these people down. Mr. H was my informant. He was supposed to meet me 2 days ago with those documents, but he didn't show. I came here to find him, and instead I found you. Now we're both in the crosshairs." The man didn't know what to believe. The officer's story sounded plausible, but there was something in his eyes, something calculating, that made him uneasy. "If you're undercover, why didn't you protect him? Why didn't you stop this?" The officer's jaw tightened. "You think I don't ask myself that every day? They're everywhere, people in power, people you'd never suspect. I had to play it safe, or I'd end up like him. But now, we have a chance to finish what he started. If we can get this to the right people, we can expose them. We can take them down." The man wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that all of this, Mr. H's death, the threats, the fear, could lead to something good. But before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the tense silence. Both men turned toward the window, and the officer swore under his breath. "They're here." Panic set in as the man looked out and saw a black SUV pulling up to the curb. 3 men in suits stepped out, their movements quick and purposeful. One of them carried a briefcase, the others had weapons concealed beneath their jackets. The officer grabbed the man's arm. "We need to go. Now." "But no time," the officer barked, pulling him toward the back door. They slipped out just as the front door burst open, the men storming in. The officer led him through a narrow alleyway, his grip firm and unrelenting. They ducked behind dumpsters, climbed over fences, and ran until the man's lungs burned. Finally, they reached a small parking lot where a plain sedan was parked. The officer shoved him inside and started the engine. The man clutched the folder tightly, his mind racing. "Where are we going?" he demanded. "To a safe house," the officer replied, his eyes on the rearview mirror. Somewhere they won't find us. The man didn't like the sound of that. He didn't want to be hidden away, waiting for the inevitable. What about the documents? Shouldn't we take them to the police? Or the media? The officer shook his head. We can't trust anyone. Not yet. First, we need to decode them. Mr. H encrypted most of the files. Without the key, they're useless. The man stared at him, a sinking feeling in his gut. And where's the key? The officer glanced at him, his expression unreadable. That's what we need to figure out. Hours passed as they drove through back roads and deserted highways. The man's anxiety grew with every mile. Something about this didn't feel right. The officer was being too vague, too evasive. And then, as they approached an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, the man realized why. The officer pulled the car to a stop and turned to him, his expression cold and hard. Get out. The man's heart sank. What are you doing? End of the line, the officer said, pulling a gun from his holster. Hand over the folder. It all clicked into place. The officer wasn't undercover. He was one of them. The man felt a surge of anger and fear as he clutched the folder tighter. You lied to me. The officer smirked. You're smarter than you look. But it doesn't matter. You've seen too much. Now, give me the folder, and maybe I'll make this quick. The man's mind raced. He had to think fast. He couldn't let the documents fall into the wrong hands. Summoning every ounce of courage, he said, You'll have to take it from me. The officer raised his gun, but before he could pull the trigger, a deafening bang echoed through the air. The officer staggered, his weapon dropping to the ground as blood spread across his chest. The man turned, stunned, to see Mr. H standing behind him, a gun in his trembling hand. The man started, but Mr. H cut him off. No time to explain, the elderly man said, his voice weak but determined. Get in the car. Now. The man obeyed, climbing into the driver's seat as Mr. H collapsed into the passenger side. I thought you were dead, the man said, his voice shaking. They tried, Mr. H replied, clutching his side. But I'd been doing this too long to go down that easily. As they sped away from the warehouse, the man glanced at the folder in the passenger seat. What now? He asked. Mr. H gave him a faint smile. Now we finish what we started. But just as the man thought they were safe, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was a video, another surveillance clip. This time, it showed his son, sitting alone at a park, completely unaware of the danger closing in around him. The man's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced at his phone. His heart dropped at the sight of the video showing his son sitting at the park. The timestamp was recent, and the meaning was clear. Whoever was after him knew exactly how to hurt him. He gritted his teeth, panic surging through him as he sped down the road. They have my son, he muttered, his voice trembling. They're watching him. Beside him, Mr. H, pale and slumped in the passenger seat, stirred. His eyes flicked to the phone screen, and his expression hardened. They're trying to force your hand. Don't let them. You give them those documents, and it's all over for you, for him, for everyone. The man couldn't think straight. His son was just a child, innocent and oblivious, sitting there in harm's way while strangers circled him like predators. What do I do? He asked, his voice breaking. I can't let them hurt him. Mr. H let out a pained breath, his voice hoarse but steady. You won't. But you can't play by their rules either. They want you to panic. They want you to run straight into their trap. The man's mind raced, but fear clouded his judgment. If I don't go to him, he couldn't even finish the thought. His son's small face in the video burned into his memory. Mr. H straightened slightly, wincing from the pain in his side. Listen to me. We can still turn this around, but we need to outthink them. They're not invincible. They're just people who think they're untouchable. That arrogance is their weakness. The man struggled to focus, his breathing uneven. What's the plan, then? How do I protect my son and stop them? Mr. H's gaze was sharp despite his weakened state. We'll use the documents. If we can expose what's in them, make it public before they can stop us, they'll have no leverage left. But we need a secure place to upload the files, somewhere they can't trace. The man swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter as he made a decision. I know a place, he said. There's a public library downtown. They have old computers, nothing fancy, off the grid enough that it might work. Mr. H gave a faint nod. Good. But we'll need to create a diversion first. They'll be watching you. The man glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black SUV trailing them again. How do we do that? You have to make them think you're going to meet them. Go to the park, but don't get out of the car. Circle the area, make it look like you're scoping it out. Once they're focused on you, I'll slip away and get to work on uploading the files. The man hesitated. The thought of leaving Mr. H alone in his condition didn't sit right with him. Are you sure you can handle it? Mr. H smirked faintly, though his face was pale and lined with exhaustion. I didn't survive this long by giving up when things got tough. Just keep them distracted long enough for me to finish the job. The plan was risky, but they didn't have time to come up with a better one. The man drove toward the park, his heart pounding with every passing second. As he approached, he spotted his son sitting on a bench near the playground, his small legs swinging as he played with a toy. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of dread. A man in a suit stood nearby, pretending to read a newspaper, but his watchful eyes gave him away. Another figure lingered near the parking lot, leaning against a car with feigned nonchalance. They're everywhere, the man muttered, gripping the wheels so tightly his knuckles turned white. Good, Mr. H said. That means they're not paying attention to me. Drive slow. Make it look like you're hesitant. They'll think you're trying to decide whether to approach. The man nodded, his throat dry as he obeyed. He drove past the park entrance, his eyes glued to his son. The boy looked so carefree, so unaware of the danger around him. It tore at the man's heart to leave, even for a moment, but he knew Mr. H was right. If they didn't finish this, none of them would ever be safe. As he circled the block, Mr. H quietly slipped out of the car at a red light, blending into the shadows. The man felt a pang of worry but forced himself to stay focused. He drove past the park again, this time parking a short distance away where he could still see his son but remain out of sight. He picked up his phone and called the number that had sent him the video. A deep voice answered after the first ring. Smart choice. The man's jaw clenched. I'm here. Let my son go. Not until we have the documents, the voice replied. Bring them to the bench, and no one gets hurt. The man's hand shook as he tightened his grip on the phone. How do I know you'll keep your word? You don't, the voice said coldly. But if you don't cooperate, I promise you'll regret it. The call ended abruptly, leaving the man seething with frustration. He glanced toward the playground, his heart aching as he watched his son. The men watching the park hadn't moved, but their presence was a constant threat. Meanwhile, Mr. H had made it to the library, moving as quickly as his injuries allowed. He found an old computer in a quiet corner and began the process of decrypting and uploading the files. Every second felt like an eternity as he typed, his fingers trembling from fatigue. The documents were heavily encrypted, but he knew Mr. H had hidden the key in a simple phrase one they had discussed during their last meeting. Back at the park, the man's phone buzzed again. Another message appeared, this time showing a countdown timer. 15 minutes. He stared at the screen, panic clawing at him. They were running out of time. Just as the timer ticked down to 10 minutes, his phone buzzed again this time. It was a text from Mr. H. Almost done. Hold tight. The man exhaled shakily, forcing himself to stay calm. He started the car and drove slowly toward the park entrance, drawing the attention of the men watching. One of them spoke into a small earpiece, likely alerting others that he was approaching. The man's heart raced as he pulled into a parking spot and turned off the engine, pretending to deliberate his next move. Inside the library, Mr. H worked feverishly, his vision blurring from the effort. The files were nearly uploaded, but the system was old and sluggish, each progress bar moving at a maddeningly slow pace. He clenched his fists, willing the process to go faster. Finally, with just a few minutes left on the countdown, the upload completed. Mr. H sent the files to multiple news outlets, government watchdogs, and online platforms, ensuring that the information would spread far and wide. He leaned back in the chair, his strength nearly spent, but a faint smile crossed his lips. It was done. At the park, the man's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a link to a news article. He clicked on it, his eyes widening as he saw the headline, "Whistleblower Documents Reveal Massive Corruption and Abuse of Power." The article detailed everything: the illegal operations, the high-ranking officials involved, and the evidence to back it up. The information was out in the open now, impossible to bury. The man looked up and saw the men in suits reacting to their phones. Their com-fa cracked as they scrambled to make calls, their voices urgent. One of them glanced toward the man's car, his expression darkening, but it was too late. The damage was done. Police cars arrived moments later, their sirens piercing the air. The men scattered, but there was nowhere to run. Officers swarmed the area, arresting the figures who had been watching the park. The man stepped out of his car, his legs trembling as he ran toward his son. He scooped the boy into his arms, holding him tightly as relief washed over him. Later that evening, the man received a message from Mr. H. It was brief but meaningful: "We did it. Stay safe." Though the ordeal had shaken him to his core, the man knew they had done the right thing. The documents had exposed the truth, bringing justice to those who thought they were untouchable. He had faced fear, danger, and impossible choices, but in the end, he had protected his son and helped make the world a little safer. As he tucked his son into bed that night, the man felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in days. The fight wasn't over. There would always be those who sought power at the expense of others, but for now, they were safe. And that was enough.